Hey guys, tonight we slip into the glittering silence of the North Pole, a place that seems like nothing more than a giant sheet of frozen water, but is, in reality, a kind of shimmering mask that hides far stranger stories beneath its surface. Picture it now, the ice stretching endlessly in every direction, the light bouncing so harshly that even your eyelids feel sunburned, and the air so dry and thin it almost crunches in your lungs. You stand there bundled in layer upon layer, but still the cold creeps in, sly and sharp, like it's trying to whisper secrets straight into your bones. You probably wouldn't survive more than a few minutes if you tried to walk out here in just jeans and a hoodie. So maybe count yourself lucky that you're only imagining it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to add a little fun to the comments, post your location and local time. I always love to see where you're listening from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about the North Pole is that its beauty feels staged, almost like a magic trick. The glittering curtain of ice, dazzling in blues and whites, hides what lies below, layers of ocean stretching down for miles. Unlike Antarctica, which is an actual continent of rock beneath the ice, the North Pole is nothing but shifting sea ice floating over deep, frigid water. The stage looks solid, but it's really just a fragile floor that can crack beneath you at any time. It's a reminder that what you see isn't the whole truth. Historically, early explorers treated the pole as if it were land waiting to be conquered. They drew it on maps as a sort of icy island, a place you could plant a flag and call yours. But when the first expeditions finally made it close enough, they discovered the unsettling truth. It wasn't land at all, just a drifting, glittering crust that never stays the same for long. And yet, even today, satellite images struggle to capture its details, as though the Earth itself enjoys keeping its top secret blurry. If you dig a little deeper into the curtain, you find the ice isn't uniform. It comes in ridges and slabs, constantly moving and colliding like very slow bumper cars. Some slabs stack up high enough to form miniature mountains, jagged and sharp, while others thin out into glassy sheets you could almost skate across. Imagine explorers pulling sleds across these ridges, only to discover that what looked like solid ground was actually a thin pane of ice floating over black water. Not the kind of mistake you want to make when the nearest hospital is 1,000 miles away. The curtain of ice doesn't just cover water, it conceals history. Fragments of old ships, supplies lost to expeditions, and even the frozen remains of unlucky explorers have been found trapped in the ice. One quirky tidbit is that whole barrels of rum and chocolate have surfaced, perfectly preserved by the cold, like strange offerings from the past. Historians still argue whether these discoveries mean some expeditions survived longer than recorded, or whether the currents simply carried their supplies to odd resting places. But perhaps the most unsettling secret the ice curtain hides is how alive it is. You imagine ice as static, permanent, a frozen monument. Yet at the pole, it breathes, groans, and shifts. You might hear a low rumble beneath your feet, as if the ocean itself were turning in its sleep. And sometimes, with no warning, the ice splits open into a crack called a lead, exposing dark water steaming in the cold air. Imagine trudging forward with your sled dogs, only to find the world has suddenly opened a mouth in front of you. Not exactly the postcard image of the pole that people carry in their heads. And there's another trick the glittering surface plays: mirages. Because of the way light bends in the freezing air, you can look across the horizon and swear you see land, mountains even, only to discover it's just the distorted reflection of far-off ice ridges. Explorers reported phantom islands, shadowy cliffs, and even what looked like castles rising from the mist. For centuries, maps included these ghostly places, drawn from accounts of men half blinded by glare and frostbite. These illusions were so convincing that some expeditions set out to find them, only to discover, after weeks of misery, that they were chasing nothing at all. So, as you stand there gazing at the sparkling curtain of ice, it's easy to feel both awed and a little tricked. The pole looks solid, but it's fluid. It looks endless, but it's temporary. And it looks pure, but it hides wreckage, bones, and echoes of human stubbornness beneath its surface. You realize that what dazzles on the outside isn't always the truth. It's a mask, a stage curtain, pulled across one of the most secretive places on Earth. And behind it, as you'll find, the real show is stranger than anything you imagined. The compass in your gloved hand is supposed to be your trusty sidekick, that little needle always pointing you north, the ultimate wingman of exploration. But here, at the North Pole, it betrays you. The needle wobbles, spins, hesitates, then points somewhere completely unreliable. It's like asking a sleepy toddler for directions. They'll tell you, over there, while spinning in a circle. What's happening is that you're standing near the restless magnetic heart of the Earth, and it doesn't play by simple rules. The magnetic pole isn't even in the same spot as the geographic pole. The one you see on globes and maps, that neat little dot at the top of the world, is just a fixed geographical marker. The magnetic pole, on the other hand, is a roamer. It drifts tens of miles every year, creeping across the Arctic like a restless ghost. Historians still argue whether early explorers even knew the difference, or whether they just assumed their compasses were broken. It's a bit like confusing the Wi-Fi symbol on your phone with actual internet access. One's just a suggestion, the other's reality. Back in the 19th century, scientists discovered that the magnetic pole wasn't only wandering, but it also flipped in strength over time. Entire magnetic storms ripple through the Earth, shifting compasses and sometimes even messing with communication systems. Picture being out here with no GPS, no radio, and suddenly your compass is pointing due south. You'd feel like the planet itself is gaslighting you. One mainstream fact is that the magnetic field is generated by molten iron swirling deep in Earth's core. Think of it like a gigantic dynamo, constantly spinning and reshaping the invisible lines of magnetism that circle the planet. But here's the quirky twist. There have been times in history when the poles actually reversed. North became south, and south became north. It didn't happen overnight. No dramatic, your fridge magnets just flew off moment. But over thousands of years, the flip occurred. Scientists studying lava flows in Iceland have found evidence of this magnetic switcheroo frozen into the rock. Now, imagine if you were an ancient navigator relying on the stars and a crude compass, and suddenly your trusty needle started leaning the wrong way over the span of a few generations. Your descendants might think the world itself had turned upside down. Some fringe theorists even suggest that stories of lost civilizations were tied to these magnetic shifts, as people literally lost their way across oceans. It's not hard to imagine. You set sail for familiar shores and instead find yourself hopelessly turned around, writing, "Here be dragons," on the margins of your maps. One little known tidbit. In the Cold War era, both the U.S. and Soviet militaries closely tracked the movement of the magnetic pole because it affected missile guidance systems. If your rockets are supposed to follow magnetic lines to their targets, you don't want the Earth deciding to slide those lines a few dozen miles to the left. It was like trying to play darts while someone kept nudging the board. And here's where it gets stranger. At the pole, compasses don't just point the wrong way, they point down. That's because magnetic field lines plunge into the Earth vertically near the pole. Explorers reported their needles sticking stubbornly downward, as if the planet were calling them straight into its core. That kind of behavior tends to unsettle even the bravest adventurer. Imagine pulling out your compass for reassurance, only to watch it stab toward the ground, like it's insisting you dig. Not exactly a comforting sign when you're standing on a few feet of ice over deep black ocean. The magnetic weirdness also plays tricks with birds and animals. Migratory species like geese, whales, and even tiny turtles navigate partly by magnetic fields. When the pole shifts, so do their paths. Some scientists wonder if unexplained beachings of whales are linked to subtle hiccups in magnetism near the Arctic. Historians still argue whether certain Viking voyages that missed their intended destinations were because the magnetic pole wasn't where they expected it to be. You can almost hear the crew grumbling, "We were aiming for England, not Greenland." And for a final sprinkle of unsettling thought, if the magnetic field ever completely collapsed during a pole reversal, the Earth would lose a big part of its shield against solar radiation. That protective bubble deflects charged particles from the sun. Without it, you'd have auroras not just in the Arctic skies, but blazing above your backyard, whether you live in Florida or Morocco. Beautiful, yes, but also dangerous. Electronics would fry, satellites could fail, and you'd probably have to kiss your GPS goodbye. Good luck ordering pizza delivery if nobody knows which way north is. So here you are, at the top of the world, compass trembling uselessly in your hand. The ice glitters around you, but you know the invisible truth. The very lines of force that guide your world are shifting, restless, and unpredictable. What you thought of as a fixed anchor is just another curtain, moving silently, keeping its secrets under layers of invisible trickery. You shuffle forward on the crunching snow, and the ground beneath you feels oddly alive, like a giant slow-moving conveyor belt. That's because it actually is. The ice at the North Pole isn't fixed. It slides and drifts, pushed by winds and currents, splitting and grinding in a constant slow shuffle. What you think of as solid land is really a floating highway made of frozen slabs, colliding and parting in a restless dance. Imagine dragging a sled across what looks like a frozen field, only to realize that this entire sheet of ice has drifted 5 miles overnight. In fact, scientists tracking research stations on the ice sometimes wake up to find that their fixed base has migrated dozens of miles while they slept. Historians still argue whether some early explorers who swore they reached the pole were simply carried closer to it on these ice rafts, instead of trudging the full distance on their own. The way these ice sheets behave is like tectonic plates in miniature. They build ridges where two flows collide, sharp, chaotic piles of shattered ice that look like frozen car crashes. Then there are the leads, those sudden cracks that open without warning, stretching for miles like a fresh scar. They reveal black water steaming faintly in the Arctic cold. One quirky tidbit: sometimes explorers would find fish swimming lazily in those cracks, as if mocking the humans clinging to the ice above. You're freezing half to death, and meanwhile, there's a cod cruising around like it's on holiday. These highways aren't just random, they follow patterns. Ocean currents like the Beaufort Gyre circle the pole, slowly dragging ice in looping orbits. It's like a lazy racetrack, with flows circling endlessly until they're pushed out toward warmer waters, where they melt and vanish. And so, the ice you're standing on might not even be Arctic-born. It could be a flow that formed hundreds of miles away, drifted for years, and finally passed under your boots. You're riding a frozen traveler, a piece of the ocean with a backstory you'll never know. Mainstream fact: during the Cold War, both American and Soviet submarines navigated these under-ice highways. They lurked in silence beneath the sheets, invisible to satellites. At times, they even surfaced through thin cracks at the pole itself, poking their periscopes into the Arctic air. Imagine the shock of a polar bear snoozing on a floe, only to have a steel machine the size of a football field suddenly break through. That's a very expensive boo. But there's also a stranger detail tucked into these drifts. Some scientists have noticed odd circular features in satellite images, patterns that don't match ordinary ice movement. Fringe theorists jump on these as evidence of secret bases or even hidden structures under the ice, while most researchers chalk them up to pressure ridges and melt pools. Still, the debate lingers. Historians still argue whether certain wartime photos show natural formations or human-made activity cleverly disguised by shifting ice. Living on these ice highways is brutal. Whole research stations have been swallowed when cracks widened beneath them. One of the most famous was an American base in the 1950s that vanished almost overnight as the floe it sat on fractured into pieces. Imagine waking up to the sound of your dormitory walls groaning, only to find your bed drifting away on its own tiny iceberg. You'd be living in a nightmare where the very floor keeps peeling apart under your feet. The Arctic animals adapt far better. Polar bears, for example, treat the ice highways as casual sidewalks. They wander across floes to hunt seals, seemingly unbothered by the constant drifting. Some seals even use the cracks as their personal doorways, popping up for air exactly where the ice splits. To you, it feels unstable, dangerous, terrifying. To them, it's just Tuesday. And here's the kicker. GPS and satellites, those high-tech guardians of modern navigation, also struggle here. Because the ice itself moves, it's nearly impossible to pin down exact coordinates for very long. You can plant a flag at what you think is the pole, and a few hours later the ice drags it away. It's like trying to nail down your position on a treadmill. This has led to awkward moments where expeditions declared victory at the pole, only to discover later that they were several miles off by the time anyone checked their coordinates. So, as you stand on this glittering white highway, you realize that the ground beneath you is less like a continent and more like a raft. It carries secrets, wreckage, and even whole communities of explorers across the top of the world, quietly rearranging them in slow motion. The North Pole isn't frozen in place, it's a drifting stage, constantly rewriting its own map, and you're just a temporary passenger on its moving skin. You glance out over the endless horizon and swear you see the outline of a mountain range rising through the mist. Sharp peaks, jagged ridges, solid land at last. But then, as you stumble closer, the vision fades into nothing but more ice and sky. Welcome to one of the oldest rumors of the Arctic, the phantom continent hidden beneath the pole. For centuries, sailors, scholars, and dreamers imagined that the North Pole wasn't just floating ice, but a real landmass, a great undiscovered continent waiting at the top of the world. Medieval maps sometimes showed an island called Rupes Nigra, a mysterious black rock said to be magnetic, pulling ships' nails right out of their hulls. Imagine rowing desperately while your ship literally falls apart, nail by nail. Not exactly the kind of place you'd put on a travel brochure. Mainstream fact, in 1906, the famous Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen reported seeing land through the Arctic haze, a place that simply shouldn't exist. He later admitted it was probably a mirage caused by atmospheric refraction, but for years his notes fueled speculation. Historians still argue whether such sightings were genuine mistakes or whether explorers occasionally exaggerated to spice up their journals. After all, I saw nothing but white for 6 months doesn't exactly get you book sales. The idea of hidden land at the pole captured imaginations well beyond the age of exploration. In the 19th century, scientists debated whether a lost continent might explain the distribution of animals and plants in the Arctic. Some quirky theories suggested there could even be tropical valleys tucked under the ice, heated by geothermal springs. It sounds ridiculous now, but remember, at the time, people were still filling in huge blanks on the world map. To them, it was as likely as anything else. And then there are the truly fringe tales, claims of hidden civilizations beneath the ice, entire advanced societies living undetected. Some hollow earth enthusiasts even argue that the phantom continent isn't on the surface at all, but inside a great opening at the pole leading to another world. Historians still argue whether these stories were born from misread explorers' journals or just pure wishful thinking. Either way, the Phantom Land became a recurring character in Arctic lore. But what about actual geology? The Arctic ocean floor does hide ridges, like the Lomonosov Ridge, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles beneath the water. It's not land in the way early explorers imagined, but it's real enough to spark modern disputes. Russia, Canada, and Denmark have all argued that this ridge connects to their continental shelves, which would give them rights to claim vast swaths of Arctic territory. So, in a way, the phantom continent still exists, just underwater, and wrapped in legal battles instead of mythical fog. One quirky tidbit: in 1907, the American explorer Frederick Cook claimed he had discovered Bradley Land north of Alaska. Later expeditions found absolutely nothing there. Maps actually marked it for years before quietly erasing it, as though admitting cartographers had been catfished by the Arctic. You can imagine the awkward silence at a mapmaker's office. So, about that big island we drew last year, yeah, turns out it doesn't exist. And of course, mirages play their part. The Arctic atmosphere bends light into strange shapes, projecting images of distant ice ridges and clouds into the sky. To a weary explorer, half frozen and squinting through sun glare, those illusions look like mountains, cliffs, or entire continents. Scientists call it the Fata Morgana effect, named after a sorceress in Arthurian legend who was known for creating illusions. And really, what better name for a place that makes you doubt your own eyes? Standing here, you realize the Arctic is full of stage tricks. The ice drifts beneath you, the horizon toys with your vision, and the maps are haunted with ghost lands. Whether it's the black rock that never was, the ridges beneath the ocean that nations now fight over, or the civilizations dreamed up by Hollow Earth writers, the phantom continent of the North Pole lingers. It's less a place than a reflection of human imagination projected onto the blinding ice. So, when you stare into the shimmering distance and see land where there is none, you're really looking at centuries of hope, fear, and confusion layered onto this drifting, deceptive world. The pole has always been less about what's actually there and more about what people desperately wanted to find. And that, perhaps, is its most enduring trick. Your breath fogs in the frigid air, and as you picture this vast emptiness, another truth creeps in. The North Pole hasn't only been a playground for explorers and dreamers, it's also been a chessboard for militaries. During the Cold War, the Arctic was less about penguins and polar bears and more about missiles, submarines, and frozen bunkers buried where no one was supposed to find them. Mainstream fact. In 1959, the United States built Camp Century in Greenland, a base nicknamed the City Under the Ice. It had tunnels, kitchens, even a movie theater, all powered by a portable nuclear reactor. Officially, it was for scientific research. Unofficially, it was part of Project Iceworm, a plan to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles beneath the Arctic ice, ready to launch at the Soviet Union. You can almost imagine the generals brainstorming it. What's colder than the Cold War? The North Pole, obviously. Of course, reality got in the way. The ice didn't cooperate. It shifted and crushed the tunnels, bending steel beams and making walls groan like haunted corridors. The city was abandoned, left to collapse into the ice. Historians still argue whether Camp Century was a bold experiment or just a doomed publicity stunt with a very expensive popcorn machine. The Soviets weren't idle either. They sent nuclear-powered submarines prowling beneath the ice cap, surfacing dramatically at the pole to prove they could go anywhere. There's even a quirky tidbit about one sub that surfaced through ice so thick the sailors had to use axes to hack their way out of the conning tower. Imagine the look on a polar bear's face, watching humans crawl out of a steel whale with pickaxes. And then there were the spy stations. The Arctic is a perfect place to park listening devices, far from curious eyes. Some stations recorded submarine movements. Others picked up radio chatter. A few, when the ice beneath them cracked, simply vanished into the sea. Picture a billion-dollar listening post slipping silently into the water, like a dropped phone sinking into the bathtub. Except this one doesn't just cost you your playlists, it costs you years of surveillance. But the most chilling part of all this is what's still there, frozen in place. Toxic waste, leftover nuclear materials, even abandoned machinery. Some of it is buried so deep under shifting ice that it's basically irretrievable. Scientists warn that as climate change melts these old camps, barrels of waste could leak into the ocean. In a twisted way, the Arctic is like a time capsule of Cold War paranoia, slowly thawing out for the next generation to deal with. Fringe theories, of course, take this further. Some claim there are still active secret bases hidden under the ice, where governments test advanced aircraft or weapons beyond public knowledge. Historians still argue whether odd satellite images, dark geometric shapes under the ice, are just shadows or evidence of hidden installations. The Arctic has a way of feeding speculation, partly because so little of it is actually watched by human eyes. And let's not forget the airplanes. During the Cold War, the U.S. stationed bombers on constant Arctic patrol, flying figure-8 routes near the pole, ready to strike. The Soviets did the same. For years, the skies over the Arctic weren't just empty. They were crowded with machines carrying nuclear payloads. Sometimes these bombers even crashed, scattering radioactive debris into the ice. Somewhere beneath your boots, those remnants may still rest, quietly ticking away in the permafrost. So here you are, standing in what looks like the quietest, loneliest place on Earth. But you know better now. Beneath the stillness, this frozen desert is littered with the echoes of war games and weapons, a stage where nations once rehearsed the end of the world. The glittering ice curtain hides not just natural mysteries, but also bunkers, waste, and plans too dangerous to admit out loud. And as you take another step forward, crunching across snow that might be resting on decades-old secrets, you can't help but smile at the irony. The North Pole, marketed to children as Santa's cozy workshop, was also, at one point, humanity's most unlikely doomsday bunker. You pause, listening to the faint creak of ice beneath your boots, and notice movement elsewhere, sharp, deliberate, and utterly wild. It's not human, and it's not a machine. It's the true sovereign of the Arctic, the animals, polar bears, seals, walruses, all living, breathing spies in this frozen kingdom, revealing truths even the most sophisticated satellites struggle to capture. Mainstream fact: polar bears have been observed swimming for hundreds of miles, following shifting ice floes, hunting seals, and marking territory. Their behavior tells scientists a lot about ice drift and climate change. But what's quirky is how these animals sometimes act almost as if they're aware of humans' curiosity. There are reports of polar bears curiously inspecting abandoned equipment, turning over crates, or even pawing at snowmobiles, as if checking whether the gadgets are worth reporting to their friends. It's the closest thing the Arctic has to undercover intelligence agents, complete with furry coats. Seals, too, are remarkable. They use leads, the sudden cracks in the ice, to surface and breathe, often in perfect alignment with the migratory paths of polar bears. It's a delicate game of cat and mouse that's been going on for millennia. Scientists track these patterns to understand both predator and prey, but sometimes the data puzzles them. Historians still argue whether certain Arctic expedition failures were due to unexpected animal behavior, like a polar bear scaring off sled dogs or seals slipping under ice traps. Then there are the more eccentric tidbits. Some Arctic foxes have been spotted carrying objects far larger than themselves across the ice. Items like discarded boots, metal scraps, or even small containers. Researchers debate whether this is play, curiosity, or some inexplicable cache-building behavior. Imagine a fox dragging your lost thermos a mile away, then vanishing into the white wasteland, leaving you to wonder if it's plotting to start a small Arctic museum. Birds aren't innocent either. The tiny snow bunting, the Arctic tern, and other migratory species navigate these extreme conditions using the Earth's magnetic field, visual cues, and wind patterns. When the magnetic pole shifts, it doesn't just confuse humans, it can throw entire migrations off course. Historians still argue whether certain lost explorers might have misjudged their own locations, because even nature was recalibrating itself in unpredictable ways. Underwater animals, too, play their part in revealing Arctic secrets. Whales, for instance, follow currents that scientists map using sophisticated sonar. Some produce mysterious sounds, clicks, groans, and pulses that linger beneath the ice for miles. These sounds baffled researchers for decades. One quirky report noted a series of groaning noises in the 1990s that resembled a low-pitched chant. Theories ranged from migrating whales communicating to the ice itself, singing as it cracked. Historians still argue whether these signals have been fully decoded or whether the Arctic simply enjoys its own soundtrack. Even the microscopic life forms tell stories. phytoplankton blooms under the ice reveal shifts in salinity and sunlight penetration, giving scientists clues about long-term climate trends. These tiny organisms become the canaries in the frozen coal mine, signaling changes before humans can even detect them. Imagine standing on a vast sheet of ice, thinking you're alone, while trillions of single-celled life forms quietly note your presence and the temperature, silently chronicling the shifting world above. And it's not just passive observation. Some animals actively influence the ice itself. Walruses can punch holes in thin ice to reach the water below. Seals may collapse weak ice to escape predators. Polar bears break through dens, shifting snow and ice in the process. Your perception of stability is constantly challenged by life that moves differently, survives differently, and observes differently. The ice beneath your boots might feel like a blank canvas, but it's teeming with history, strategy, and survival lessons you can barely imagine. So as you trudge forward, remember this: you are not the only one studying this frozen desert. Every crack, every drift, every shadow moving across the ice might be an animal silently marking its territory, probing for food, or simply exploring, sometimes revealing truths that humans have missed for centuries. The North Pole is a theater, and the actors aren't just the explorers or scientists. They are the living, breathing creatures, quietly revealing secrets in ways subtle, bizarre, and utterly mesmerizing. The sun hangs impossibly in the sky, refusing to set. You tilt your head back, squinting at a relentless disk of pale gold that glares down on endless ice. It's the phenomenon of the midnight sun, 6 months of continuous daylight, followed by 6 months of night. Your body, accustomed to a rhythm of dawn and dusk, protests with confusion. You feel like a time traveler trapped in a day that never ends, or a night that never begins. Mainstream fact: the polar regions experience this because of Earth's axial tilt. During summer, the North Pole tilts toward the sun, bathing it in constant light. During winter, it tilts away, cloaking everything in darkness. It's a simple astronomical truth, yet its effects on human biology are anything but simple. Your circadian rhythms rebel, sleep cycles collapse, and you start seeing patterns in the ice that aren't there, shadows that look like faces, or cracks forming words. Historians still argue whether early Arctic explorers' reports of hallucinations were due solely to scurvy and exhaustion, or whether months of unbroken daylight played a larger role. Quirky tidbit: some modern scientists actually live for months in polar research stations under continuous sunlight, conducting experiments on sleep deprivation, mood disorders, and hallucinations. One study even reported that researchers would go outside at odd hours, convinced they were late for appointments, only to remember that late doesn't exist in this part of the world. Imagine stepping outside for a morning coffee and the sun is exactly where it was 6 hours ago, unchanged. It's the longest, most confusing Monday you'll ever endure. During the polar night, the effect is reversed. Total darkness descends, and the auroras light the skies with eerie greens, purples, and reds. You walk across the ice, seeing the northern lights shimmer directly overhead, ribbons of color reflected on the snow. Some explorers reported that months of darkness led to a heightened sense of hearing and smell. Imagine noticing the tiniest crack in the ice or the faintest movement of a distant animal. Historians still argue whether prolonged darkness might have made certain expeditions appear lucky simply because the explorers' senses became unnaturally attuned. Animals, unsurprisingly, handle this light shift far better than humans. Polar bears hunt, Arctic foxes play, and seals navigate using the dim glow of bioluminescent plankton in the ice-flecked water. Humans, in contrast, invent elaborate light schedules, lamps, and timers in an effort to trick their bodies into normalcy. Some researchers jokingly call it playing pretend Earth, while the planet ignores your schedule entirely. And then there's the odd cultural side effect. Explorers' diaries are filled with humorous notes about confusion over timekeeping. One sailor wrote, "I have no idea if it is dinner or breakfast. I suspect it is both." Another reported practicing an entire day backwards just to maintain a sense of order. It's a reminder that the pole is as much a psychological challenge as a physical one. Even modern technology struggles. Solar panels get overexposed during continuous sunlight and underperform during polar night, and cameras have trouble adjusting automatically. You might think you've captured a perfect sunrise, only to realize your sunrise is actually noon in disguise. And satellites, which rely on predictable shadows for imaging, can't always distinguish ice textures correctly under these extreme light conditions. So, as you trudge across the ice under the unyielding sun, you realize that time itself is fluid here. Minutes stretch or shrink depending on the season, your mind races or slows depending on the light, and you're forced to adapt or hallucinate. The North Pole doesn't just hide secrets under ice or water. It manipulates reality itself, bending human perception in ways subtle, strange, and occasionally hilarious. You might try to joke about it to your companions, but even laughter feels stretched, like a sound wave bouncing off infinite white walls. And as you look skyward, you wonder whether the endless sun is simply observing you, keeping its own secrets behind that constant glare. Your gaze drifts down to the scattered charts and maps in your pack, and you notice something peculiar. Centuries of cartographers have filled the Arctic with mistakes, imaginary islands, and monstrous sketches. Early maps show Friesland, Skraeling Land, and even grotesque sea creatures supposedly lurking near the pole. It's a reminder that humans have always been willing to fill gaps in knowledge with stories, pictures, or sheer imagination. Mainstream fact: during the age of exploration, maps were as much about speculation as observation. Sailors' reports, second-hand tales, and misread compasses often led to islands that didn't exist, coastlines drawn in impossible arcs, and sea monsters poised to snap at your ship's bow. Cartographers relied on rumor almost as much as evidence. Historians still argue whether some maps were deliberately exaggerated to encourage exploration or whether they genuinely reflected sailors' misconceptions. Quirky tidbit: some medieval maps even included the idea of rivers flowing with gold dust, mountains made entirely of amber, or islands inhabited by people with dogs' heads. Imagine navigating toward a land full of half-human dog creatures, only to find yourself in freezing white nothingness. You'd have to question every assumption you've ever held about geography. The errors weren't limited to imagination alone. Optical illusions in the Arctic, like Fata Morgana mirages, could make distant icebergs appear as towering cliffs, or make open water look like solid land. Sailors often reported landing on islands that vanished when they returned later. It's the polar equivalent of chasing a mirage in the desert, except colder, wetter, and with a higher risk of frostbite. Some maps also reflected geopolitical ambitions. Nations drew lines around regions they wanted to claim, even if no human had ever set foot there. In a way, maps became political statements, not just tools for navigation. One could argue that some phantom islands were placed strategically to justify territorial claims, giving cartographers a mix of artistry, ambition, and bluffing skills. Historians still argue whether these fake islands influenced early Arctic treaties or were simply whimsical errors. There's even an odd tale about the so-called Crocker Land, reportedly discovered by Robert Peary in 1906. Later expeditions couldn't find it at all, leading to suspicions that Peary either misinterpreted a mirage or played a subtle prank on future explorers. You can imagine the exasperated cartographers plotting an entire landmass that never existed, only to scratch it out years later. Maps weren't just imaginative, they were aspirational. They encouraged explorers to push into unknown ice deserts, documenting the Arctic's mysteries one misstep at a time. And even today, the legacy lingers. Modern satellite maps are far more accurate, yet still struggle to capture seasonal ice shifts, leads, and ridges. So, as you pore over these ancient charts, you realize the Arctic is not only a physical frontier, but a mental one. It has challenged human perception, forced imagination to compensate for reality, and rewarded creativity in navigation, even if that creativity sometimes meant inventing islands, monsters, or rivers of gold. The North Pole doesn't merely conceal itself under ice. It has been carefully veiled in human misunderstanding for centuries. You pause on a ridge of ice, catching your breath, and let your mind wander to the more exotic theories about what lies beneath. Fringe thinkers have long insisted that the North Pole isn't just ice and water. It's the gateway to a hollow earth, a cavernous realm hidden under the ice, populated by unknown civilizations or even advanced technologies. It's the kind of theory that makes you raise an eyebrow while quietly checking your boots for polar bear prints. Mainstream fact: the Earth is not hollow. Seismic studies, gravitational measurements, and drilling projects confirm that beneath the ice lies ocean and mantle, not a hidden world. Yet, the hollow Earth idea has captivated imaginations for centuries. Early 19th century writers, like John Cleves Symmes Jr., proposed that giant openings at the poles could lead inside the planet, and some expeditions were allegedly launched to find these entrances. Historians still argue whether these proposals were intended as serious science, social satire, or a bit of both. Quirky tidbit: fringe theorists point to a variety of unexplained phenomena as evidence for hidden polar realms. Everything from unusual magnetic readings to reports of unidentifiable lights beneath the ice. One story describes a submarine crew that claimed to see enormous structures through thin ice, later dismissed as optical illusions. You have to admit, even if completely wrong, it's an exciting mental image. Your imagination doing somersaults over frozen water. The North Pole has always been fertile ground for speculation. Its remoteness, extreme conditions, and the unreliability of early instruments made it the perfect blank canvas on which people could project anything. Tales of hollow lands, underground rivers, and lost civilizations filled the gaps left by exploration. Historians still argue whether some sightings were genuine optical tricks or deliberately sensationalized accounts intended to attract funding for expeditions. A particularly eccentric story involves supposed entrances at the exact pole itself, marked on some maps with mysterious symbols. Supposedly, these openings led to a lush inner world, with creatures unseen on the surface. Some enthusiasts even argued that the auroras were windows into this hidden realm, sunlight spilling through cracks in the ice and atmosphere. Fringe though it sounds, these tales persisted for decades, showing the human tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with narrative. Modern science occasionally pokes fun at these claims, but they've left an enduring cultural footprint. Hollow Earth enthusiasts still debate the real locations of entrances, pointing to satellite imagery anomalies or misread ice formations as proof. It's a reminder that even in a thoroughly studied world, mystery can survive if the imagination is willing to work overtime. And yet, even in the realm of fantasy, there's a lesson here. The idea of a hidden world beneath the North Pole mirrors the very real fact that the ice itself conceals untold secrets. Shifting ocean currents, sunken vessels, and geological formations no human has seen firsthand. While the hollow Earth might not exist, the Arctic's hidden realities are no less extraordinary, and in some ways even stranger. So as you trudge across the ice, considering theories that verge on the impossible, you realize that the pole is not just a location, it's a mental landscape, a place where reality and imagination intertwine, teasing the mind while the body shivers. Somewhere between the drifting ice and your own racing thoughts, the line between science and myth blurs, leaving you marveling at the unknowable. Your boots sink slightly into a soft ridge of ice as you imagine the first humans who claim to have reached the North Pole. The story is less straightforward than school books suggest. Early explorers were racing against each other, battling frostbite, hunger, and the merciless Arctic winds. But some of them may have bent the truth just a little to claim victory. Mainstream fact: Robert Peary famously declared he reached the North Pole in 1909, but modern analysis of his records and travel speeds has led many historians to doubt whether he actually got there. His assistant, Matthew Henson, documented the journey meticulously, yet even his notes can't definitively confirm the claim. Historians still argue whether Peary's achievement was genuine or a carefully constructed exaggeration designed to secure fame and funding. Quirky tidbit: rival explorer Frederick Cook claimed he reached the pole a year earlier in 1908, but his evidence was widely discredited. What's amusing is that part of the controversy stemmed from photographic oddities, like the famous pole marker photos showing nothing but white ice, which could be interpreted in any way depending on your optimism or paranoia. You can almost picture them arguing in some frozen courtroom, waving ice chunks as evidence. The competition didn't stop there. Expeditions often relied on sled dogs, primitive navigation tools, and human endurance tests that would terrify even the most hardened athletes today. Some teams went months without seeing another living soul, subsisting on pemmican, seal meat, and the occasional cache of chocolate. Imagine enduring that while trying to convince the world that you had arrived first. Mistakes, exaggerations, and even outright lies were almost inevitable. Interestingly, ice drift plays a role in the controversy. Remember how we talked about shifting ice highways? A team could reach the pole one day, only for the ice beneath them to drift miles over the next week. Does that count as reaching the geographic point? Historians still argue whether explorers understood this phenomenon or whether it simply gave them a convenient excuse to fudge the numbers. Fringe speculation adds a more entertaining layer. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that early explorers might have been secretly guided by governments or even aliens, because why not? Letters, journals, and mysterious equipment caches have fueled all sorts of imaginative theories. though most are dismissed by mainstream science. Yet the sheer audacity of these claims keeps the North Pole an eternally alluring and mysterious place. And while these heroic or exaggerated tales make for gripping narratives, they also overshadow quieter, real dangers. Hypothermia, frostbite, and scurvy were constant threats. Men sometimes disappeared without a trace, leaving only the drifting ice as witness. These vanished souls remind you that the Arctic isn't forgiving of ambition or deceit. So, as you trudge across the frozen expanse, imagining explorers planting flags and scribbling logbooks in the snow, you recognize a paradox. The pole was both a proving ground and a stage, a place where human ambition collided with nature's indifference. It's a reminder that the stories we inherit are often as much about ego and imagination as about actual achievement. Your boots crunch over the glittering ice, and your thoughts drift further back in time to a world completely different from the frozen desert you're standing on. The North Pole hasn't always been ice and snow. Fossil evidence reveals that millions of years ago, this region was a lush, tropical environment teeming with plant and animal life that would seem alien to anyone familiar with penguins and polar bears. Mainstream fact: fossils of ancient plants, insects, and even reptiles have been discovered in Arctic regions, indicating that the polar climate was once warm enough to support diverse ecosystems. The Earth's tilt, continental drift, and shifting ocean currents have transformed the Arctic from jungle to ice sheet over millions of years. Historians still argue whether certain fossilized remains suggest continuous habitation by ancient species or sporadic migrations driven by climate cycles. Quirky tidbit: paleontologists have found fossils of palm-like trees and crocodile relatives above the Arctic Circle. Imagine a cold weather crocodile lounging in what will one day become a frozen wasteland, like a reptilian sunbather stranded in geological time. It's hard not to smirk at the thought, even if the reality is mind-boggling. The Arctic's frozen crust preserves these remains with astonishing clarity. Bones, leaves, and pollen trapped in sediment tell a story that contradicts the modern notion of eternal ice. These fossils also provide clues about how life adapted to extreme seasonal changes, since even in warmer periods, the pole experienced months of darkness in winter. Early Arctic plants evolved to survive the long, cold nights, demonstrating resilience that would amaze any contemporary biologist. Then there are the more peculiar discoveries: fossilized insects that seem too delicate to have survived Arctic winters, yet somehow thrived in this ancient environment. Scientists debate whether these species were migratory, adapted to long periods of darkness, or entirely different from anything we know today. Historians still argue whether the presence of these fossils suggests a radically different climate or simply microenvironments that offered pockets of warmth. Some theories take this further. A few fringe geologists speculate that ancient Arctic swamps might have hosted creatures unknown to modern science, from giant amphibians to massive insects. While there's no concrete evidence for these more exotic claims, the idea that the North Pole could once have been a thriving tropical world is enough to make you reconsider the notion of permanence. And then you step carefully, realizing that the ice beneath you might be hiding more than shifting sheets and crevices. Buried under centuries of frozen layers, there could be remains of creatures that no human has ever catalogued. Essentially, time capsules waiting to be uncovered. It's a reminder that while the surface seems inhospitable and empty, it conceals a story of flourishing life, evolution, and the slow, relentless change of the planet itself. Even today, researchers drilling through ice cores uncover pollen, microorganisms, and sediments that hint at these ancient worlds. Each layer is a page in the Arctic's long-forgotten history, waiting to be read. And the more you walk, the more it becomes clear. The North Pole is not just a place of cold and ice, but a repository of the planet's memory, preserving the bizarre and beautiful twists of life that came long before humans ever set foot or paw on the ice. So as you trudge along, thinking about palm trees, crocodiles, and fossilized insects under your boots, you realize the pole is a paradox, a frozen desert on top, yet a tropical garden in its ancient past. It hides life and death, warmth and cold, continuity and change, all layered beneath the glittering white we see today. Your boots sink slightly as you approach a subtle ridge, and a strange thought strikes you. The North Pole isn't just a place of ice and drifting animals, it's also a place of extreme geology. While most people imagine a smooth, featureless ice cap, the Arctic Ocean beneath your feet is a rugged, restless landscape filled with ridges, trenches, and underwater mountains that rival those on land. Mainstream fact: the Arctic ocean floor contains the Lomonosov Ridge, a massive underwater formation stretching nearly 1,000 miles, dividing the ocean into distinct basins. Geologists believe it formed hundreds of millions of years ago as continents collided and drifted apart. Historians still argue whether this ridge, along with other submerged formations, influenced ancient navigation and early Arctic exploration. Quirky tidbit: the Lomonosov Ridge and surrounding seabeds occasionally create acoustic anomalies, causing submarine sonar readings to appear strange or distorted. Cold War-era crews sometimes reported ghost ships or phantom sonar contacts that vanished without explanation. You can almost picture nervous sailors whispering to one another, "Was that a Soviet sub or a sea monster with a sonar disguise?" Even beneath the thick ice, the Arctic seabed is dynamic. Earthquakes, tectonic shifts, and underwater landslides constantly reshape the landscape, sending icebergs on unpredictable journeys above. These undersea events sometimes create waves known as ice tsunamis, small but enough to jostle floating ice or research stations. Historians still argue whether certain mysterious disappearances of sleds or equipment in early expeditions could have been caused by these sudden, unrecorded underwater movements. One of the stranger features is the Gackle Ridge, a mid-ocean ridge that slowly spreads the seafloor apart. Volcanic activity here is rare but real, with hydrothermal vents spewing mineral-rich water under kilometers of ice. These vents harbor unique life forms, from giant tube worms to microbes that thrive in extreme pressure and cold. It's a reminder that life and geological energy persists even where you'd least expect it. Fringe theorists sometimes take these details into more dramatic territory, suggesting hidden volcanoes or geothermal hotspots beneath the ice might explain mysterious heat signatures seen in satellite imagery. While most of these claims are unverified, the Arctic does indeed hide energy and movement far below the surface, shaping ice flows, currents, and even animal behavior. Imagine walking across what feels like solid ice while molten rock churns quietly miles beneath you. And of course, these undersea features have geopolitical implications. Countries like Russia, Canada, and Denmark argue over continental shelf extensions tied to ridges like Lomonosov, claiming rights to resource-rich areas under the ice. The ice above might look pristine and empty, but under your boots and the Arctic Ocean, Nations have mapped, measured, and argued over the hidden wealth below. Even the ice itself interacts with these geological features. Flows get trapped against underwater ridges, forming pressure ridges and rough terrain on the surface. These subtle interactions influence everything from polar bear hunting patterns to the placement of research stations. You realize that the landscape you see is a mere surface veneer for a restless, powerful world beneath, where geology, life, and human ambition intersect in ways most people never imagine. So as you step carefully across the ice, listening to the faint groan of shifting sheets, you become aware that every footfall is above a hidden dynamic world. The North Pole isn't just a frozen top, it's a layered stage of activity, geological, ecological, and human, that quietly shapes what you see and feel at the surface. It's a reminder that even the stillest ice carries a pulse from below. You pause again, noticing how the ice glints almost unnaturally in the weak Arctic sun, and it occurs to you that the North Pole has been central to the history of exploration, intrigue, and even disaster. Stories that rarely make it into history books. Beyond flags and claims, the pole has been a testing ground for human endurance, innovation, and sometimes sheer foolishness. Mainstream fact, early 20th century expeditions, like those led by Nansen, Peary, and Amundsen, pushed the limits of human survival. Teams endured sub-zero temperatures, blizzards, and months of isolation, often losing fingers, toes, or worse, to frostbite. Yet these missions yielded crucial data about ice drift, polar magnetism, and survival techniques. Historians still argue whether the toll was justified by the knowledge gained, or whether explorers were seduced more by fame than science. Quirky tidbit: some explorers brought unusual companions on these treks. Nansen reportedly carried a small sled dog that became infamous for stealing food caches, while others documented sightings of Arctic hares teaching their young to dodge sleds. Probably coincidence, but it adds color to the cold landscape. Imagine trying to ration chocolate while a tiny thieving dog is judging your every move. The Arctic was also a stage for more bizarre adventures. In 1937, the Soviet icebreaker Sedov drifted helplessly in the ice for years, turning into a makeshift research station. Crew members improvised everything from hydroponic gardens to sled experiments while frozen in place. It was less about reaching the pole and more about surviving the ice's whim. Historians still argue whether these long-term drifts provided more scientific insight than conventional point-to-point expeditions. Even failed attempts have lessons. Countless explorers vanished without a trace, swallowed by cracks, crevices, or the unpredictable flows we discussed earlier. Some expeditions turned into accidental circumnavigations of drifting ice, documenting phenomena no one had seen before, even as they failed to claim glory. Fringe stories sometimes suggest that these lost explorers found hidden valleys or strange structures beneath the ice. Though there's no verified evidence, the tales persist. Modern expeditions aren't immune to the unexpected. Satellite tracking helps, but storms, pressure ridges, and mechanical failures still claim equipment and occasionally lives. Quirky reports include GPS devices giving phantom coordinates, ice drills sinking into mysterious crevices, and even snowmobiles mysteriously losing traction on deceptively smooth ice. It's as if the Arctic itself refuses to be fully mapped or mastered. The pole has also inspired legends and hoaxes, tales of secret Nazi bases, mysterious lights, and underground tunnels proliferated in the mid-20th century. Historians still argue whether these claims were fueled by wartime paranoia, misidentified ice formations, or deliberate fabrications. Regardless, the stories underscore humanity's fascination with what might be lurking under the seemingly uniform white landscape. And for a lighter twist, some explorers kept diaries noting bizarre ice personalities, features in the flows that seem to follow or mimic their movements, creating the illusion of sentient ice. While purely psychological, it's a reminder that isolation and monotony in the Arctic can make you question reality itself. So, as you continue your trek, you realize the North Pole isn't just a coordinate on a map. It's a testing ground for imagination, survival, and endurance. It has claimed lives, fostered legends, and inspired some of humanity's most daring and sometimes absurd endeavors. The ice is both teacher and trickster, rewarding persistence while punishing hubris. You stop and glance at the horizon again, realizing that the ice isn't just a landscape, it's a living archive of climate history. Every ridge, crack, and snowdrift records centuries of temperature swings, storms, and environmental shifts. Beneath your boots lies a layered diary of the Earth itself, preserved in frozen silence. Mainstream fact: ice cores drilled from Arctic glaciers and sea ice reveal information about atmospheric composition going back hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists analyze trapped air bubbles to understand ancient CO2 levels, volcanic activity, and even massive forest fires from distant continents. Historians still argue whether some interpretations of these cores are fully reliable, especially when minor contamination or ice movement can skew readings. Quirky tidbit: some ice cores have preserved tiny particles of cosmic dust, meteorites, or even traces of ancient human activity far beyond what you'd expect at the pole. In a sense, the ice acts like a giant natural time capsule, holding secrets from the entire globe. Imagine pulling out a sliver of ice and discovering evidence of a distant eruption in Asia from 50,000 years ago. It's like the Earth keeps its own scrapbook. The ice also records abrupt climate events. Layers of melted and refrozen snow indicate past warm periods, while dense compressed layers reveal centuries of extreme cold. By analyzing these sequences, scientists can reconstruct patterns that help predict modern climate shifts. Some of these findings are surprising. At certain times, the Arctic may have been largely ice-free during summer, creating ecosystems that seem almost impossible to imagine now. Then there's the strange phenomenon of cryoconite holes, small depressions in the ice filled with dust, microbes, and algae. These tiny ecosystems survive in extreme conditions, showing that even the harshest Arctic environments aren't truly lifeless. Fringe researchers sometimes speculate that these holes could harbor unknown microorganisms capable of surviving global catastrophes, which sparks both scientific curiosity and sci-fi imaginings. Historians still argue whether microbe survival in extreme ice could offer insights into early Earth life or even extraterrestrial conditions. Satellite imagery reveals another quirk: subtle variations in ice thickness, color, and texture that don't match surface weather alone. Some of these anomalies correspond to under-ice currents, submerged ridges, or even sunken icebergs that have settled over decades. The ice isn't just passive, it interacts constantly with the ocean beneath and the atmosphere above, creating a complex system that's difficult to fully model. The melting Arctic of today only adds layers to the story. Research stations monitor glacial retreat, ice loss, and shifting currents. Yet, even as we track these changes, There's an eerie reminder that the Arctic has been recording Earth's history long before humans could, and will continue long after we leave. Your footsteps might leave temporary impressions, but the ice preserves everything in long, cold memory. So, as you trudge forward, listening to the faint groan of ice under pressure, you realize you're walking on a chronicle of centuries. Every shift, every crack, every drift is a note in a story that no human alone could fully read. A story written in frost, compressed snow, and subtle variations in crystal structure. The North Pole, you understand, is more historian than human, preserving memory, life, and mystery in equal measure. You pause at a thin patch of ice and notice something glimmering beneath the surface, a remnant of human activity long buried. The North Pole isn't just a natural archive, it's also a graveyard of artifacts, lost supplies, and abandoned attempts to conquer its extreme conditions. Pieces of history litter the ice, silently narrating the ambitions, failures, and miscalculations of those who came before. Mainstream fact: remnants of early 20th century expeditions, from sleds to scientific instruments, have been discovered partially encased in ice. These artifacts offer unique insights into the technology, clothing, and survival strategies of Arctic explorers. Historians still argue whether the preservation of these items is purely accidental or whether the ice itself has acted as an unwitting protector, saving relics that would have decayed elsewhere. Quirky tidbit: in 1913, explorers lost a small cache of chocolate, tins, and personal letters during a blizzard. Decades later, researchers discovered some of these items remarkably intact, still recognizable as early 20th century snacks and mail. Imagine opening a frozen box of century-old chocolate, part delight, part ethical dilemma. Do you eat it or leave it for posterity? The Arctic's ice moves constantly, so artifacts are never entirely stationary. Sunken sleds or equipment caches can resurface years later, carried by shifting flows or melting glaciers. Some relics have traveled tens of miles from their original location, creating unexpected connections between historic expeditions. Historians still argue whether these movements can accurately trace the roots of lost explorers or whether they introduce more confusion into the historical record. Some fringe enthusiasts suggest that certain Arctic discoveries, oddly shaped metallic objects or unidentifiable debris, might hint at secret military projects or even alien involvement. Most of these claims have been debunked, yet they add a sense of mystery that persists in the popular imagination. You can almost picture a polar bear sniffing at a strange metallic box, pondering whether it's edible. Even modern expeditions leave traces, although more carefully documented. GPS trackers, scientific instruments, and temporary shelters become part of the Arctic's ever-growing palimpsest. Ice cores taken for research, for instance, are meticulously recorded, but fragments sometimes drift away, creating accidental time capsules that might be found decades later. And then there's the human error aspect: supplies left behind, markers misplaced, and forgotten equipment serve as reminders of the immense difficulty of operating in such a hostile environment. The ice doesn't discriminate. It preserves and moves everything alike, whether it's a scientific breakthrough or a human mistake. So as you trudge along, observing the scattered artifacts beneath the ice and snow, you understand that the North Pole is simultaneously a natural and human archive. It holds evidence of life, ambition, error, and curiosity, all frozen in time. Your footsteps connect to a long chain of explorers, dreamers, and wanderers, and every mile you traverse adds your own subtle imprint to this living historical canvas. The wind picks up, carrying tiny snow particles that sting your cheeks, and you suddenly realize the North Pole isn't just about ice, animals, or explorers. It's also a place of unique human adaptation. Over centuries, indigenous peoples and intrepid adventurers have developed ingenious ways to survive, thrive, and even find moments of comfort in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Mainstream fact: the Inuit and other Arctic peoples have lived in polar regions for thousands of years, developing clothing, tools, and hunting methods perfectly suited for extreme cold. They use igloos for shelter, sled dogs for transportation, and intricate knowledge of the ice to track prey and navigate safely. Historians still argue whether modern depictions of Inuit life have romanticized survival skills or accurately captured their daily challenges. Quirky tidbit: some Arctic communities used moss, feathers, and even fish skin to waterproof garments, combining materials in ways that seem bizarre to outsiders but were highly effective. Imagine stepping into boots made partially of fish skin, slippery yet surprisingly warm. It's a reminder that necessity truly is the mother of invention, even if the aesthetics are unconventional. Explorers also adapted, albeit less gracefully. Early expeditions often relied on trial-and-error clothing and equipment, resulting in frostbitten fingers, soaked garments, and improvised shelters. Nansen famously experimented with fur, wool, and canvas layers, adjusting as he learned what worked and what didn't. Some failures were humorous: gloves too big, boots too small, tents collapsing under snow weight. Historians still argue whether certain Arctic tragedies could have been avoided with local knowledge, or whether they were simply the inevitable cost of exploration. Then there's the ingenuity of modern research stations. In extreme isolation, scientists have designed modular, insulated shelters, heated walkways, and even indoor exercise equipment to maintain health during long polar winters. Some quirky innovations include reindeer-powered generators, snow-covered greenhouses, and underground ice tunnels designed to minimize heat loss. It's almost like the ice itself is a puzzle they are constantly trying to solve. Animals, of course, influence human adaptation too. Hunters track polar bear movements to avoid danger, while seals' breathing holes inform safe travel routes. Even migratory birds signal changing weather patterns, providing subtle cues for survival. Fringe observers sometimes suggest that these animal interactions go deeper, hinting at a hidden curriculum of environmental lessons the Arctic teaches anyone paying attention. Historians still argue whether these interactions significantly altered early explorers' strategies or merely reinforced existing knowledge. And humor, surprisingly, is another adaptation. Diaries often note improvised games, storytelling, and practical jokes to combat boredom and isolation. One expedition reportedly held an Ice Olympics, racing sled dogs across floes, while another staged a mock court trial for a stolen chocolate tin. These small acts of levity are reminders that humans can find warmth, even in the coldest and loneliest places. So as you trudge along, shivering and adjusting your layers, you begin to appreciate the ingenuity layered across centuries of Arctic survival. The North Pole isn't just a challenge, it's a classroom, a testing ground for human adaptation, creativity, and the oddest forms of ingenuity. It teaches that survival here isn't merely about endurance, it's about cleverness, humor, and learning to read every whisper of wind and shift of ice. The ice groans beneath your boots, a low, almost musical vibration that reminds you the Arctic is alive in subtle ways. You realize that the North Pole isn't just a laboratory of survival and history, it's also a stage for extreme weather, storms, and phenomena so powerful that humans can barely comprehend them. Mainstream fact: the Arctic experiences some of the most severe storms on Earth, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and sudden whiteouts that can disorient even experienced explorers. These storms shape ice formation, ocean currents, and animal behavior. Historians still argue whether early expedition failures were caused more by inadequate preparation or by these merciless, unpredictable weather events. Quirky tidbit: polar scientists sometimes describe seeing ice fog, a phenomenon where the cold air causes water vapor to condense into tiny crystals, creating a glittering, ghostly haze that can make objects appear distorted or doubled. Some explorers in the past believed they were seeing phantom camps or ghost ships, only to realize the illusion was atmospheric. Imagine mistaking a drifting ice floe for a rival expedition. It's an Arctic optical prank of nature. Then there are the katabatic winds, dense, cold air rushing down slopes at terrifying speeds. These winds can accelerate suddenly, flattening snowdrifts and erasing tracks. Some early explorers wrote about feeling like they were being pushed backward by invisible hands, a poetic description that's oddly accurate. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of these winds contributed to navigational errors or even mental breakdowns. Temperature swings are another strange quirk. In a single day, the Arctic can shift from bone-chilling cold to mild enough that the top layer of ice melts briefly, only to refreeze overnight. These cycles create ice ridges, melt pools, and hidden cracks that make travel perilous. Fringe survivalists sometimes claim that these microclimate anomalies can hide entrances to secret crevasses or even ancient artifacts, but most of these claims remain speculative. And then there's the aurora, whose beauty belies its electrical power. These northern lights aren't just visually stunning, they're the visible side effect of solar storms interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Satellites, communications equipment, and even compasses can be temporarily affected. Early explorers often recorded disorientation during particularly intense displays, mistaking auroral light for nearby camps or ships. Historians still argue whether some polar mysteries, lost teams, or misread coordinates were influenced by auroral misperception. Icequakes, another little-known Arctic phenomenon, add yet another layer of drama. When thick ice sheets shift suddenly, the sound can resemble distant thunder, and the vibrations can travel miles. Some researchers speculate that early explorers' reports of roaring ghosts were actually icequakes echoing across frozen seas. Imagine lying in a tent, hearing the ice groan, and questioning whether it's alive, or just trying to laugh at you. Even temperature inversions can play tricks on perception, bending light and creating mirages that make cliffs, icebergs, or open water appear closer or further away. Explorers often misjudge distances, leading to dangerous detours or accidental rescues of empty snowfields. Fringe theorists sometimes suggest that these optical illusions might explain tales of phantom islands or mysterious lights reported near the pole. So, as you trudge onward, feeling the wind whip against your face and hearing the subtle creaks and groans of the shifting ice, you realize the North Pole isn't merely a cold landscape, it's a theater of extreme forces. Storms, winds, lights, and vibrations all conspire to create an environment that tests perception, endurance, and imagination, revealing the Arctic as a dynamic, almost sentient presence. You trudge onward, noticing subtle patterns in the ice that almost seem intentional, as if the North Pole is arranging itself to teach you lessons in observation and patience. Beyond storms and wildlife, the Arctic is a place of hidden currents, mysterious ridges, and natural phenomena that confound even the most experienced scientists. Mainstream fact: the Arctic Ocean is crisscrossed by powerful currents such as the Beaufort Gyre and the transpolar drift, which influence ice movement, temperature, and salinity. These currents can carry ice floes hundreds of miles, altering navigation and sometimes isolating research stations. Historians still argue whether some lost expeditions were victims of these invisible highways or simply human miscalculation. Quirky tidbit: researchers have observed polynyas, openings in the ice that remain unfrozen even in extreme winter. These areas of open water are hotspots for wildlife, including seals, whales, and migratory birds. Sailors often describe these spots as miracle oceans, offering both danger and opportunity, like secret oases in a frozen desert. Imagine carefully approaching one, only to have a curious polar bear observe you with the same cautious interest. The interaction of ice and water creates strange sounds, too. As ice sheets grind against each other, they produce booming noises known as ice quakes or glacial groans. These sounds can be disorienting, echoing over miles and sometimes mistaken for distant storms or explosions. Fringe observers occasionally claim that these noises are the Arctic communicating or even warning intruders, scientifically improbable but undeniably eerie. Seasonal melt and freeze cycles add layers of complexity. During summer, thin ice sheets fracture under the sun, forming leads and pressure ridges that shift unpredictably. Winter solidifies these formations again, but often in entirely new configurations. Early explorers who relied on maps from the previous year sometimes found themselves in completely altered landscapes. Historians still argue whether these unpredictable changes explain some missing expedition reports, or whether human error was the primary culprit. The Arctic's magnetic anomalies are another source of intrigue. The North Magnetic Pole drifts, sometimes rapidly, making compass readings unreliable. Explorers were occasionally led astray, thinking they were moving in one direction while the magnetic field pulled them subtly off course. Fringe theorists sometimes link these shifts to strange sightings, UFOs, or hidden zones, though the real explanation is entirely natural. Even modern technology struggles. GPS can fail under certain polar conditions, and satellite imagery sometimes misinterprets ice features due to reflections and shadows. You realize that no matter how advanced humans become, the Arctic retains an ability to surprise, confound, and humble those who enter its realm. And humor remains a survival tool. Diaries from long-term expeditions include reports of ice ghosts, absurdly slippery patches, and even imaginary companions conjured to combat isolation. It's a reminder that, in addition to danger and mystery, the Arctic challenges human creativity, perception, and patience in equal measure. So as you trudge forward, noticing the subtle hum of ice movement, the glimmer of polynyas, and the invisible pull of shifting currents, you begin to appreciate the North Pole as a dynamic, living system. It's a place where physics, geology, biology, and human imagination intersect, creating an environment both unforgiving and endlessly fascinating. The cold begins to bite deeper as you navigate jagged ridges of ice, and you realize that the North Pole isn't merely a scientific or historical puzzle, it's a political chessboard. Beneath its pristine white surface lies potential wealth, sovereignty disputes, and geopolitical tension that most casual observers never imagine. Mainstream fact: nations bordering the Arctic, including Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States, have made competing claims over sections of the polar seabed, largely due to the potential for oil, natural gas, and mineral resources. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea allows countries to extend continental shelf claims if they can prove the seabed is geologically connected. Historians still argue whether early exploration maps influenced these modern claims more than scientific evidence. Quirky tidbit: Russia planted a titanium flag on the seafloor beneath the North Pole in 2007, a symbolic act reminiscent of Peary's historic flag planting over a century earlier. While largely ceremonial, the gesture sparked international amusement and concern, illustrating that human ambition for recognition persists even in the coldest reaches of the planet. You can almost imagine the flag gently swaying on the seafloor, a frozen proclamation to anyone or anything that might be watching. Economic stakes are immense. Melting ice due to climate change opens previously inaccessible shipping lanes and resource deposits. This transforms the Arctic from a desolate expanse into a hotspot for strategic planning, environmental monitoring, and, occasionally, tense negotiations. Some fringe theorists suggest secretive military projects or hidden resource caches, though most claims remain unverified. Historians still argue whether past territorial disputes foreshadowed modern conflicts or if international cooperation ultimately prevails. The North Pole is also a site of international research collaboration. Despite political tension, scientific teams from multiple countries share data on ice thickness, wildlife migration, and climate change. These efforts sometimes intersect with military interests, creating a subtle dance between diplomacy and security. You might think you're merely looking at ice, but beneath the surface, nations are maneuvering as carefully as polar bears circling breathing holes. Then there's the legal and symbolic significance. No country owns the geographic North Pole, and the Arctic Treaty Framework encourages peaceful use and scientific research. However, as ice recedes, overlapping claims grow more contentious, and previously theoretical rights become practical considerations. Historians still argue whether these evolving legal frameworks reflect a new era of cooperation or a rekindling of old imperial ambitions. And humor, surprisingly, creeps in even here. Commentators sometimes joke that the Arctic is the world's coldest boardroom, where flags are planted, maps are redrawn, and heated debates take place, quite literally in terms of human frustration and metaphorically in diplomatic terms. Even in the most serious of disputes, the absurdity of claiming miles of ice under extreme conditions is not lost on observers. So as you trudge across the frozen expanse, noting how politics, economy, and law overlay the ice beneath your boots, you begin to understand that the North Pole isn't just a remote wilderness. It's a stage for human ambition in all its forms: scientific, exploratory, and geopolitical. Beneath the frozen crust lies a story of competition, negotiation, and imagination, revealing yet another layer of the pole's hidden truth. The wind is quieter now, almost as if the North Pole itself is holding its breath, and you realize you've arrived at the edge of understanding. The pole is not just ice, currents, or historical milestones. It's a place where science, myth, survival, and human ambition intersect in ways that make the mind reel. Mainstream fact: the Arctic plays a crucial role in regulating the planet's climate, acting as Earth's air conditioner by reflecting sunlight, controlling ocean currents, and storing vast amounts of fresh water in its ice sheets. Melting Arctic ice contributes to rising sea levels and shifts in weather patterns worldwide. Historians still argue whether humanity fully grasped the consequences of industrialization on this fragile system until recent decades. Quirky tidbit: beneath the ice, hydrothermal vents and subglacial lakes host microbes that survive without sunlight, some of which are considered extremophiles. Scientists joke that these organisms are the ultimate Arctic hermits, tiny creatures living entirely apart from the world above, blissfully unaware of human intrigue. You might imagine them throwing microscopic parties under kilometers of ice while we squabble over flags and resources. The North Pole also continues to inspire imagination. From hollow earth theories to ghostly explorers' tales, from mythical islands on old maps to modern satellite anomalies, the Arctic is a canvas for human creativity, fear, and curiosity. Fringe theorists have long speculated about secret bases, alien contact, or lost civilizations beneath the ice, even though evidence remains elusive. Historians still argue whether these stories are purely entertaining, a reflection of cultural anxieties, or a testament to humanity's desire to find patterns in the unknown. Even wildlife adds an unexpected dimension. Polar bears, Arctic foxes, and seals interact with the ice in ways that reveal the subtle balance of this ecosystem. Their behavior influences human navigation, scientific observation, and sometimes survival itself. You watch a polar bear in the distance, its white coat blending seamlessly into the snow, and consider that even apex predators are mere participants in the pole's larger narrative. And humor persists even here. Explorers' diaries are filled with anecdotes of lost sled dogs, frozen chocolate, and miscounted miles. Little reminders that no matter how extreme or deadly the environment, humans find ways to laugh, imagine, and endure. The North Pole teaches resilience, adaptability, and humility, often through discomfort, confusion, or absurdity. So as you trudge the final stretch, feeling the subtle shifts of ice beneath your feet, you understand the truth. The North Pole is a living paradox. It is stark, yet vibrant, empty, yet full of secrets, harsh, yet endlessly inspiring. It conceals as much as it reveals, holding stories of Earth's past, humanity's ambition, and nature's quiet persistence. And in that silence, you sense its ultimate lesson. Even in the coldest, most remote places, life, curiosity, and mystery persist. As you finally pause, letting your body sink slightly into the forgiving snow, the wind slows and the ice seems to exhale. The harshness of the journey fades into a gentle hush, leaving only the soft whisper of shifting sheets beneath your boots. You begin to notice the small rhythms, the quiet creak of ice, the distant shimmer of aurora, the subtle pulse of the cold beneath your skin. It is a lullaby of the planet itself, a slow, steady reminder that even the wildest landscapes have their own cadence. You breathe in the sharp, clean air, letting it fill your lungs, and then slowly release it, imagining each exhalation carrying away the tension of movement and thought. Your mind drifts over everything you have seen, the shifting ice, the strange phenomena, the tales of explorers long gone, and the hidden life beneath the frozen surface. Each story, each fact, each tiny quirk of nature now settles into your awareness like snowflakes coming to rest, soft and silent. The colors of the aurora fade slowly, the wind whispers through subtle crevices, and the world seems to slow, stretching minutes into gentle, almost imperceptible moments. You feel the enormity of the pole's history and the fragility of human presence here, yet a quiet reassurance persists. The ice endures, the currents flow, and life, whether microscopic or grand, finds its way. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sensations of cold, light, and quiet wrap around you. In the stillness, you realize that the North Pole has shared its secrets, its lessons, and its mysteries without judgment. Its story is one of resilience, of curiosity, and of wonder, a soft invitation to observe, reflect, and dream. Now, as your mind drifts gently toward rest, let the Arctic's hush guide you into a deep, calm sleep, carrying its vastness, mystery, and subtle beauty with you.